just going to jump in pre-event here and say I am super pumped for this. I can't wait to hear what you guys are going to share. I hope everybody in the crowd is really excited for this. I think it's going to be awesome. I can't wait. I've been waiting for this one for a few weeks now.
Who is XDC Community? Our mission is to facilitate a prosperous, decentralized developer community for the XDC network. So everything that the development team needs, we're here to support that. Big focus on the XDC network improvement proposal process, XIP. It's not unique across, it's not unique for XDC. There have been EIPs for Ethereum, KIPs for the Clayton network. What really this is a way to standardize your smart contracts, how code is being deployed, your consensus mechanisms, your protocols. It's standardizing the platform. And any large blockchain has this type of process in place. We're providing a decentralized developer portal. So how-tos, documentation, tutorials, FAQs, example code, developer education will all come through XDC Community. We're very active in the community through communications. So whether it be Discord, Twitter, Medium, LinkedIn, on the XDC forum, xdc.dev. We're here to provide resources and help you through where applicable. Right now we have 5 languages of support, so feel free to reach out in any language that you're most comfortable in. And then the big thing is enabling hackathons, judging, connection to project teams, connecting project teams to venture capitalists and industry participants. I'd like to introduce Mr. Jon McBee to talk about decentralization.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I want to talk about decentralization, but talk about it at kind of a higher level, provide some context for what decentralization is or has been, honestly, throughout human history, and then talk about looking forward, how decentralization, I think, will play a large role in our future, and how blockchain is positioned to help get us there. You're gonna have to do my slides. Yeah, so go ahead and sit. So first I want to talk about graph theory for a minute, and nothing crazy, just as a way to try to quantify centralization, so we know what we're talking about. So in graph theory, networks are centralized when one or a few nodes are much more important than all the other nodes. That's an interesting definition. We don't actually define importance there, right? There's a bunch of ways to define importance in graph theory. Here, we're going to give it a certain definition, and then we're going to expound upon how that impacts eventually decentralization on blockchain. So go for it. So in graph theory, when we look at a graph, this is an example of a graph here. We see nodes, we see edges, and then so the edges obviously connect the nodes, and we can come up with this number called a degree, and the degree of a node is the number of edges incident to it. It's just the number of nodes connected to each other. So you can simply count the lines that connect the nodes, and then you can assign each node a degree. And we can use that definition, if you go forward, to talk about what it means to be important, right? So we can say that a network is centralized when one or a few nodes are much more important than all the other nodes. So by that, and we'll show you in a second here, centralization of an entire network depends on the definition of importance in individual nodes, and the importance of a node can be defined by the number of edges incident to it. So using that definition, if you go forward one, we can see that node 5 is much more important than the other nodes on this network. And using that metric, we can say that this network is centralized. And a good way to think about it is that this one node with so many edges can become a point of failure for the entire network. And that's going to be important as we start to dive into blockchain. So if we flip that on its head and talk about decentralization, we can make a claim that networks are decentralized when all nodes on the network are approximately equal in importance. And I'll state, I should have stated this earlier, when I say nodes, don't think about nodes in the context of blockchain, right? I'm not explicitly talking about validators validating transactions on a chain. We're just talking about networks in general here, networks of anything, and participants of the network. Each participant is a node, and the edges define how they're connected to each other. And so still, decentralization of the entire network depends on the definition of importance in individual nodes. And here, the still importance of the node is defined by the number of edges incident to it. And so a decentralized network looks more like this. We can quantify it by counting the edges, and we can see that in this network, there is no one node more important than any other node. So there is no one single point of failure on this network. Now, decentralization is nothing new. So switching from graph theory a little bit to talk about human history. You all the way back to the Neolithic period, about 12,000 years ago, communities looked a lot different than they look today, right? They typically had less than 100 people. That meant that these small communities of people could easily trust each other. They could trust each other because they had close relationships. You know everybody, and it makes it harder to get away with bad behavior, right? So you can trust that people are going to act in the best interest of the group. And you can try to draw that as a graph, and it looks something like this. Obviously, there's not 100 nodes on this graph, but we only have so much space. But you end up with a group of people in this network that all are aware of each other. They understand the social dynamics of each other, and it makes it easy to hold each other accountable. And that actually goes and impacts how people interact with money. It's interesting, and we'll look at this. The change in decentralization to centralization of human civilization tracks pretty well with how people transacted throughout history. And so in a decentralized community, it's much easier to barter for goods with people. You know the people, you can trust the people, and you can exchange goods and services pretty easily. But as civilization develops, about 10,000 years ago, human civilization went through this thing called an agrarian revolution. There was a big shift to agricultural civilizations that enabled communities to become larger. Individuals in those communities became more specialized, and eventually you get the formations of cities and towns. And so as you start to change how people live, it makes it easier for more people to live together. And that obviously has a dramatic impact on society, where things start to become centralized. It becomes no longer becomes possible for everybody to know everybody. Everybody can't trust everybody. And so as civilization develops, centralization is just kind of a byproduct that you get. And so the graph of how people interact starts to look more like this. It's heavily centralized. Now, typically there could be centralization imposed by a government, enforcement of laws, where you end up with these single points of failure, but they're necessary because they kind of remove some of the chaos from this growing civilization. They enable people to exist together. And again, that shows itself in how people transact, where you move away from a bartering system and you start to exchange money for things that you need. And so everybody can agree that this, in this case, a gold coin is worth a certain amount of money, and now that one gold coin can be traded for a fish or for a cow or for a pair of shoes, whatever value the market dictates. And there's this interesting concept called Dunbar's number. Dunbar's number is a suggested cognitive limit to the number of people with whom one can maintain stable social relationships. It turns out that number is about 150 people. And this all ties in, right? Relationships in which an individual knows who each person is and how each person relates to every other person. It turns out they can't grow bigger than 150. And so as people change how they live and more people start to live together, it becomes unknowable. Like you can't expect people to act a certain way because you don't know them. It's harder to hold them accountable. And so you have to shift from a decentralized society to a centralized society with single points of failure that help to enforce different rules around how people interact. And again, money tracks, right? How people interact with each other monetarily moves as well from trusted to trustless. And so you start with the barter system, then you move to gold, but then you want to put rules around the gold, and you make sure that you can create little fungible pieces of gold that are worth a certain value, so it's easier to exchange. And then you worry about transportability of money, and you shift to paper because it's easier to move value that way. Eventually you end up with these plastic credit cards, where if the credit card company gets hacked, then all of a sudden your social security number is out there for sale on the internet. And so as you move from trusted to trustless, these single points of failure become more and more important. So now let's talk about decentralization in the context of blockchain in particular. So we can put a definition up there. Networks are centralized when one or a few nodes are much more important than all the other nodes. We've established that idea. Centralization exists when the concentration of control of an activity or organization or blockchain is under a single authority, and that single point of failure. A global network of nodes of equal importance. So this is what blockchain is aiming to be: a global network of nodes of equal importance, maintaining a digital ledger of transactions, or a global network of people of equal importance, making peer-to-peer transactions. So this is interesting because now we have a monetary system that allows peer-to-peer transactions where you don't have to trust the person on the other side. That trust has been kind of solved through software. So I want to propose, so even higher level, talking about decentralization, 4 pillars of decentralization. And now when you think of decentralization and blockchain, the most common definition that people will think of is this geographic definition, where a blockchain is decentralized if the actual nodes, the validators that validate transactions and mine blocks, if those are spread out around the world, a global network of computers. That global or geographic decentralization makes it difficult for any one jurisdiction to impact the network. And that's how we will typically think of decentralization and blockchain. But I think that's just one aspect of it, right? So what we can actually think about instead of just decentralization is let's try to identify single points of failure. And then we can try to kind of create a taxonomy of different kinds of decentralization. And these are all important. They're all important to think about and consider. So another type of decentralization could be programmatic, right? So programmatic decentralization is, or centralization, when one entity controls the source code for the network. So you may not typically think about decentralization in those terms, but if updates to the consensus mechanism are pushed out and they're completely controlled by one group of people, then they have an inordinate amount of control over the network itself, and they are a single point of failure. We'll talk in more detail on that one in a second. Another type is economic, where one entity controls the majority of the supply of tokens on the network. Again, you're faced with a single point of failure, or unilateral decision-making on how funds get appropriated. This applies to networks where there was a big pre-mine, and I'll make an argument that some of these types of centralization are actually, I think, necessary early on in the development of a new blockchain. But that for the blockchain to be successful, it trends towards decentralization over time. And the fourth one, public. One group of people holds an inordinate amount of influence over the network. And again, that's something we'll see as being almost necessary at first, but over time it needs to diminish. So if we dive into each one in a little bit more detail, mentioned this one already. Geographic decentralization is what most people associate with the term decentralization in the context of blockchain, and it's achieved when nodes on a network are distributed across multiple jurisdictions. Right, so we can try to define importance in this context, and we're really talking about the number of nodes per jurisdiction or the number of nodes per country. You don't want any one entity able to bring down the entire network. Now, there's still going to be issues with, say, access to the network. That's going to be a problem that people need to figure out how to solve. But that's the same issue we have with the internet today. So I think we're working towards a solution to that. Programmatic decentralization. We achieve this when the ability to fix issues, add features, define standards exists outside of the group that created the network. And so you can look for different measures of importance here, definitions of importance here. One easy one is the number of pull requests per developer. You want to see a lot of developers working on the core components of the software for the network, and you want to see a lot of different pull requests coming in from those different developers. Go to the next slide. So Jonathan mentioned earlier the XIP process, which is a process that the XDC community has put in place for the XDC network. And it is a standardized improvement process. And like Jonathan mentioned, there's nothing unique or novel here. We literally forked the Ethereum improvement process. Ethereum forked the Bitcoin improvement process. And Bitcoin forked the Python improvement process. So there's nothing novel, but it is very necessary, right? So this process in particular for any chain is a huge step towards programmatic decentralization. This is a formal process that defines how developers interact with each other to make the blockchain better. There's kind of a unspoken understanding that people who are working on XIPs are doing it because they want, in this case, the XDC network to be as technically sound as possible, right? And in doing so, they're decentralizing the actual source code, how it's developed, what's being built, even how it's documented. So for context, a centralized, programmatically centralized network would be a network where one entity controls the source code and doesn't really even document the changes that are being rolled out to the network. When something fails, there's only one group of people that knows how to fix it. And if they're not accessible for some reason, then worst case scenario, the blockchain stops producing blocks and can't function as a blockchain. This should be a huge concern for everybody, no matter what network you're on. Are these processes in place? I can guarantee you that, like we're seeing now with industry coming and adopting blockchain, industry looks at these metrics. They need to know that there are processes in place that enable anybody to come and suggest an improvement to the network, to suggest a fix for an issue on the network. You would have to be insane to come and build a project on a network without one of these types of processes in place. There's no reason to trust that if you have an issue, it would get resolved. Economic decentralization, as I mentioned before, is a measure of the decentralization of the token supply on the network. This is important for networks with pre-mined tokens, which the XDC network is one of. And I think that it can be necessary, right? So I'll talk about it more a little bit later, but as networks come into existence, you need some adoption. Otherwise, what's the blockchain doing? You need people transacting on the blockchain and people who care about it. And so having an entity that controls a group of a pool of tokens for funds, able to allocate those funds directed towards growth is important. But as the network grows and becomes adopted, it has to trend towards decentralization, right? And so economic decentralization is achieved when the mechanism that determines how the majority of the token supply is used exists outside the core group that created the network. And so while it's valuable for a young network to have some control over how funds are spent to grow the network, over time, that needs to be decentralized. And that's not an easy thing to do either, right? I mean, programmatic decentralization is much more difficult than it sounds. You look at Ethereum, for example, it's a huge network. The number of people involved in the actual decentralization of the core repository is measured in the hundreds, right, for a network that big. For economic decentralization, it's equally difficult to make that shift. That's one thing the XDC Community Initiative is really focused on right now, is decentralizing and democratizing the way that funds are spent from, in this case, the Ecosystem Development Fund. That's one of the main things we're trying to do. And it's another thing to consider when you're looking at decentralization of a network. Public decentralization may not be as obvious as the other ones. Public decentralization is a hallmark of growth in the community of people that exist around the blockchain network. Tech adoption is interesting. When any new tech comes out, you get the innovators, right? The innovators come first. And then you get the early adopters. And the innovators and the early adopters will have a loud voice. You know, they're the people out looking for new technology. They're the ones that get excited when they see it. And for a new blockchain in particular, they're going to be the ones with the loudest voice in the community. And that's necessary at the start of the blockchain, because that's how you get people interested and you get people to know about the blockchain. So they want to come and build on it, and they want to come and use it for transactions. But again, over time, that has to change, right? So public decentralization is achieved when the group of innovators and early adopters who first embrace the blockchain cease to have the loudest voice in the community. I think this is really important. We're talking about influencers here, and you want their influence to diminish over time, where you have people of equal importance in the network all speaking about the network, all building on the network. There's no one single point of failure, right? I think we've all seen, there's an article that came out recently. I think it was talking about Uniswap. It's something like 98% of all tokens that have been developed on Uniswap were designed rug pulls, right? It's a huge problem with cryptocurrency in general. It's a bad connotation with the name. People associate cryptocurrency with people getting scammed. And a large part of that is because of this public centralization, where you have people with a very loud voice and maybe not the best interest of anybody but themselves in mind. For any real adoption to happen, that has to change. The conversation has to shift from cryptocurrency to blockchain, right? Cryptocurrency is kind of a misnomer. The currency part is just an artifact of what we have today. It's almost the low-hanging fruit for the technology. I think that the actual value, which is coming with adoption, is the shift to decentralized applications that can work together. And so, as I mentioned before, decentralization and single points of failure. As you get these networks that grow, you have to be careful that they're growing in a decentralized fashion. Because if they aren't, whether it's programmatic, whether it's economic, whether it's geographic, or whether it's the people in the community, these single points of failure they can become issues. And I can guarantee you that they're going to be hurdles to adoption by industry, which is what we all want. And so we talked about how this Dunbar number tracks with the shift from decentralization to centralization, and how human civilizations function, and how that tracks with money. I think that blockchain is positioned to move back towards decentralization, right? To get that ability to interact in a different way through this new technology. And right now, when people hear about it, like I just said with cryptocurrency, the understanding is we're talking about how money moves. But we need to also consider information. We also need to consider identity. Get forward one more time, but then stop. You can think of the internet in the same chronological growth as we see here, right? The internet started, it was very decentralized. But over time, it's become centralized, right? It's gotten to the point now where governments can restrict what people in their country can access on the internet. And so this access to information, which was world-changing, has slowly become more and more centralized over time. And same with identity, right? We talked about identity. This growth in community is really the change of decentralized identity to centralized identity. And so you go from knowing people in your circle and being able to hold them accountable because you interact with them day to day, to needing an ID with your address on it to enter a bar to prove you're 21, right? And so this concept of identity is now commingled. And to prove identity, you end up having to also leak other information about yourself you may not want to leak. And so blockchain is positioned to solve a lot of different problems here, not just the money problem. Go on to the next one. And I really do believe that decentralization leads to mass adoption of this technology. And so as we've seen, humans tend to move from simple to complex while adopting centralization to remove the chaos from the complexity. Mass adoption by industry won't happen until single points of failure are removed. I just don't see it happening. A complex system with single points of failure will extend beyond a network of value. It will decentralize information, identity, and most likely the biggest use cases are ones that we can't see yet, right? When people first started getting onto the internet in the late 80s, early 90s, nobody saw Facebook coming, right? Nobody saw the ability to stream music and stream videos and stream games. We just aren't there yet. We're still building. It's so early. And so in that context, build the future is literally building the future, right? I think the future is decentralized, which is kind of the completion of this arc where we started 12,000 years ago with human civilization in small groups, small decentralized groups. And then as civilization changed, so did how we interact with each other. It became more centralized because it had to. But I think that the next phase of civilization is going to really depend on technology like blockchain to push us back towards decentralization. And it's not just crypto, it's not just money. I like to say cryptocurrency isn't money 2.0, it's going to be application 2.0. It's going to be decentralized applications that work together. They're going to use value, they're going to use identity as primitives of a programming language to change the way that people interact all around the world.